So the title, if you guys didn't read the description below, is Having Trouble Talking to Your Kids. And when I brought up this topic, when I was thinking about something that I wanted to talk with you guys about, it was something that was on my heart because I've seen countless times with kids and parents, and not just before I got here, but also when I've been here, is that I've seen this wall, this difficulty when it comes to talking about difficult situations, especially when it comes to talking about things like the opposite sex, boys and girls, or sex in general. It can be really awkward. It can be really difficult. It can be very uncomfortable. And these are walls and things that get put up because, the enemy doesn't want us talking about these kinds of things. And it's so vital that we do, though. Another reason why I wanted to talk about this is because I love communication. For those of you who know me, I love talking. I love talking with other people. I love communication in the aspects and the nuances of it. And it's such an important aspect of life because you can't really grow without communication. You have to be able to talk to people. Another reason I chose this is because I know how important the child-parent relationship is. And I can know how difficult it can be to effectively communicate with a child, especially as they grow, because your kid's ability to speak and communicate with you often changes as they grow older. Sometimes we think with higher reasoning, and we assume or want our kids to think at that same kind of mentality, that same kind of biblical mentality, but our kids, our children, our teenagers often focus on the now. They don't focus on the ways to think ahead or plan, and often they don't focus on ways they can communicate openly with you guys. A lot of times you have to come to them. But the main reason I wanted to bring up this topic of communication with your kids is because I've seen indicators before, and in our community with our kids at every single level, really, of missing our kids' hearts and minds at many different circumstances or many times. Often the world has a hold of their minds and their hearts right now, whether it's in the music or the TV or the movies or the friends and things that are influencing them in their life right now. And if we're not careful, we may be too late by the time we talk with them about some of these serious topics, and often awkward topics. Again, the most obvious being sometimes those opposite sex relations or sex in general. And that's why I'm going to focus mainly on this topic today, because when you talk about this, it highlights the importance of relationships with our kids, the importance of our communication habits. We talk about the importance of starting now because of the influences in our life, and that it spans just past this topic of sex or the opposite sex, and it parallels what we want to focus on with communication, because if you have some of the communication habits that we talk about here will parallel into drugs or alcohol or peers or difficult relationships or maybe even abuse or different things like that. That are those hard, difficult topics that we need to have. But it definitely focuses on relationships. The relationships not just with the opposite sex, but the ones they have with us, the ones they have with their peers, and especially the ones that they have with God. What kind of relationships are your kids seeking after right now? Because we all have that desire. We all have that need for intimate relationships and deepening relationships. It's a question of how are they deepening their relationships, and who are they deepening it with? Is it us? Is it God? Is it their peers? Is it their girlfriends or boyfriends? Those are the questions we need to be asking. So, when should we have these conversations? Unfortunately, it's sooner than you think. That's the best answer I can give you, really, is this idea that we have this thought of, maybe it's by this age that we should be talking to our kids about this. But often it's a lot sooner, especially in this day and age. I have some stories or some analogies I wanted to throw by you and see, is this something that you guys see with your kids? Or maybe this might be something that you see with your kids later because your kids are at different stages, whether they're in elementary, middle, or high school. So a dad is concerned that this cute boy crazy behavior that has escalated to concerning level with their daughter, it's escalated a lot from 10 to 15 years old. And she seems obsessed to have this boyfriend, and if she's not, then she's depressed or sad when she doesn't have one. Another scenario, a mom is insistent upon putting guidelines in a place for her teenagers who are beginning to date. She thinks she should get a say in whom her kids are dating, and what they should be allowed to do. Whereas on the other hand, the dad's like, nah, let them learn from their mistakes. It's fine. They'll figure it out. You see a little bit of difference in ideals there. Maybe a couple is becoming concerned for their Christian child who's becoming serious with a non-Christian significant other. It is now affecting their behavior noticeably, and their priorities have changed. Sometimes that happens depending on the people that we have in our lives and we're putting into and they're putting into us. And yet they're adolescent, their teenager doesn't see a problem with this. And wait a second, because some situations can be even trickier. Parents find their son's website history and discover he's been looking at pornography. They're not sure if it's a normal teenage behavior and if they should just let it go, or should they talk to him. A dad shares the frustration with his young teenage son about his growing concerns that his son's being overwhelmed with the focus on girls. He's texting them, he's being flirtatious with them, and they're being flirtatious with him, and he's getting this big ego. He worries that all the drama will distract his son from everything else in his life, from school, from homework, from other relationships, from his relationship with God, and that he worries the temptations of girls might be too much for him. A mom is having trouble with her 17-year-old daughter who has been dating a guy for over a year now. She is worried that they may have already become sexually intimate, but she does not know how to broach the subject with her daughter. Now, if any of these situations sound similar and or scary, that's the point. I'm going off of a book, just so you know. It's called The Talks. It's by Barrett Johnson. It's a good book, this is where I derive a lot of my points from, and I felt that this was a good organizational tool and a lot of important points about talking with your kids about these kind of subjects. But the point of this book, that's the point of this book and this talk today, is to scare you a little bit. I want you to know that there is hope in seemingly hopeless situations, and that we're not alone, and that God has given us biblical principles to help coach our kids in healthy relationships with the opposite sex and with difficult situations. So when do we have to have these conversations with our kids? And the answer is ja. Well, at least sooner than you think, like I said. Take whatever age you think you should talk to your kid about a certain topic, and then probably subtract a few years, maybe 3 or 4, and that's probably the age you should be talking about them. You can do this with different topics with your kids, not just the opposite sex, because the thing is that our kids are being shown these things, whether you like it or not, at much younger ages. If we want to have the biblical perspective of things for our kids in their sexuality, then we must begin to paint that picture before the world messes it up. Our kids are exposed at younger and younger ages to sexual images and worldly views of sexual relationships. We have kids at every level that are exposed to these sexual images. We have them in high school. I'm talking about our school at ECA. I'm talking about in high school, in middle school, even in elementary school in some cases. But the crazy thing is that you guys have more influence than you think. Whether your kids are in elementary, whether in middle school, whether in high school. But we must not operate under this false assumption that we have more time than you think. Otherwise, you're going to be caught off guard. Let me scare you a little bit more with some more statistics from the United States. But I would assume at this point that it's pretty similar in Colombia when you have such a wide access to internet and TVs and movies, and your kids are seeing the same thing, and they all have phones. I know it. I see them all the time. I say, put it away, or I'm taking it. But here's some more frightening statistics. 48% of high school students in America have had sexual intercourse. By the time they turn 19, 70% have had oral sex, of which they don't consider to be real sex. Only about 1/3 of teenagers agree with the statement, a couple should not live together unless they're married. They do not agree with that statement. The average age of first-time exposure to pornography is 11 years old. That one hits pretty deep. Of an offline support group of porn addicts, more than half said they got addicted between the ages of 12 and 14. And 83% of teens say that moral truth depends on the situation. That's a scary thought, because you'd think we teach our kids these biblical perspectives and values, so they should know, right, that it's not dependent upon a situation. It's dependent upon what the Bible tells us about that situation. So the role of parents. You guys have a very important role. In Deuteronomy 6-7, Moses talks about the importance of this role of the parents. He gives an extensive overview of the ways and laws of God and reminds us the essential role of passing on that legacy of faith to the next generation. And he puts it in this way. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. I don't know but if you ask me, that sounds like pretty much all the time. And yes, Moses is talking about the 10 Commandments. He's talking about that foundational message of the gospel, if you look at the context of that passage. But I also argue that he's talking about the importance of coaching our children through difficult life changes and situations, such as sexuality or the opposite sex. It's your job as parents to do the teaching. I know that sucks, it's hard, it's not easy. But it's your job, not the world's. But we often let the world do it, don't we? Your kids need you to coach them through how the opposite sex thinks. They need to be coached through their physical body changes and the feelings that they don't usually understand. And they need someone to answer the questions they have, but they don't know how to verbalize all the time, you know? Odds are there's more questions in your kids' minds than they're willing or even know how to ask you sometimes. And that can be difficult because it's like, well, if they don't know, how am I supposed to know? But unfortunately, many parents have neglected this responsibility, hoping that their kids will figure this out from our pastors or our youth leaders, or even sometimes here at ECHA from us teachers, since we disciple and we work with them. And parents hope that others will do this job for them. In the book that talks, the author writes about many young married couples that he's talked with. He's a pastor. He counsels, he meets, and he talks about many common regrets and desires that these young married couples have had. He talked about how many of them, they spoke about these regrets towards themselves. They feel like they failed themselves sexually for their husband or for their wife later. They wish they had not given their hearts away so many times or to so many people. Many guys are surprised that their struggles with lust and pornography don't go away after marriage. Many express being taken advantage of and that regret of not being protected by their parents. They talk about this. The majority had said how they wish their parents had done more to guard their hearts and keep them from making stupid decisions. Unfortunately, we can't guard our kids all the time from all of their stupid decisions. They're going to make some. That's just the reality of life. We've all made our own mistakes. We've all not guarded our own hearts and not listened to the advice of our parents at times. However, we can help them, prepare them, starting now to face the struggles that lies in the world that the world has in store for them. So you can ask this question. You tell me, what's better? Taking the time for difficult preparation and awkward conversation, uncomfortable conversation with your kids, or that regret later on of knowing that maybe you could have done more, maybe you could have acted sooner, and maybe it would have helped your kid get through a difficult situation that you're going through right now, or that you might go through in the future. It's a tough question to think about, because you have two really hard choices there. Neither one's easy. The next slide, I thought in the book, it talks about what would it look like if we looked at our kids from an anthropological, objective perspective of like if an anthropologist came in and they were looking at our kids at different ages, different developmental stages, what would they say? What were the observations that they'd make? So to help us look at these boy-girl relationships, we're going to turn to this anthropological viewpoint, this objective viewpoint. So what would they say at the different stages? First one, at elementary. You get these boy-girl interactions, but they're very limited. Mostly the boys tend to hang out with the boys, and the girls tend to hang out with the girls. There's some interplay between the genders, however, nothing usually to do with sexual interest. Some exceptions like, oh, he likes her or she likes him. But it's more to impose that awkwardness of like, ha ha ha, laugh at them, not because there's an actual like relationship that they're seeking here, but to embarrass them, which is kind of normal of our elementary schoolers, if you've had them. And for most elementary schoolers, they're still at this age where it's like boys are gross and girls have cooties. So you don't have to worry too much about that boy-girl interaction right there. But that's what it looks like. You have early middle school, which you got those 5th and 6th graders. And they still don't have a lot of interest in the opposite sex at this point. However, there are some early bloomers who do. They often set the pace for others. You put some 11-year-olds in the middle school environment, especially with older 8th graders who are a little bit more advanced when it comes to this kind of stuff, and it's ripe for indoctrination, or it's ripe for kind of giving them an idea of what it looks like in the future, because they're getting exposed right there by the 7th and 8th graders into that boyfriend-girlfriend culture. Some 5th and 6th graders will enter into an early form of dating that's not really dating. It's more of that talk of like, oh, who's hot? She's hot, he's hot. That kind of talk. It's not really mature. Again, it's not that kind of relationship of like, oh, I really like you, I care for you deeply. It's just like, oh, they look good. But they might not even realize what that means. It's just something that they've learned. You got later middle school. By 7th and 8th grade years, you sometimes get this playful flirtation that gives way to an actual pairing or a couple at times. Now, some of the boys are going out. They're not actually going out. They just see each other at school and church or in the community, or if they live close to each other type thing. And these relationships have little substance beyond the kids saying that we're together or I like them. But that doesn't stop them from expressing affection, especially because they have their phones. Like I said, they'll text all night, all day if they can, and they will use social media sites to talk to each other as well. And the other thing is that since girls tend to mature faster, and the girls are both physically older and mentally more mature, they tend to take these relationships a little bit more seriously than the guys, because the guys will tend to lose interest pretty quickly, and then you're left with an 8th grade girl who is brokenhearted, and she's hurt, and it's like, to us, it's like, it's 8th grade, it's not real, calm down. But to her, or to him, because that can happen to a guy too, that they feel hurt. You have the early high school years now. At this age, the boys begin to catch up with the girls maturity-wise, and the relationships begin to intensify a little bit. A lot of it is hormonal at this point, but there's some clearly defined relationships to begin to pop up, and it could be very brief, but some have some stamina that it could last throughout high school or a couple of years or something. But the relationship, again, is still confined to those main areas like school or at home if you live next to each other, or church, because they don't have the ability to drive or move around, and it's still based on what you guys kind of let them do or are willing to help them out with. But again, it can become intensified because of this electronic connection. They can text all night. They can be on social media. They can send each other winky faces and kissy faces and all that kind of stuff. And you have this real possibility of people, these kids at this young age, kind of becoming obsessed with these relationships a little bit. Especially since you have this culture that with its music, its music videos, its TV, its movies, it's targeting teens to express their affections for one another, and it normalizes emotionally and physically significant relationships. It becomes the expectation and necessary to have a significant other or some kind of emotional connection, which can become very powerful. Because like we talked about, God made us social creatures. He made us to have this desire for emotional and deeper, intensified connection. But who are we connecting ourselves with? You got this later high school years. At this age, it can be pretty similar to the earlier high school years. However, these kids often have greater means of transportation now, which is kind of getting a little scarier there. It's getting a little bit more real. Then when they say they're going out, they might actually go out. I mean, if they have a car, if they have friends with a car, they can go out and hang with each other alone often. And when they're freed from these restrictions of parents and the limitations of group activities, like they don't just have to hang out with their friends and they don't have to just hang out in front of their parents, things can get pretty physical pretty quickly. Depending on the couple, it's not uncommon for them to initiate kissing, for them to start with experimenting with sexual touching, oral sex, or even sex itself. The desire for the significant other grows, especially when self-esteem is caught up in whether someone likes them or not. Next, we have these college years. This is the time often where people are like, okay, these kids, these young adults, 18, 19 years old, even 20, it's like, all right, I'm free. I'm in a house. I'm going to college. I might be living on my own, maybe, depending on the culture and things like that. And it's time to date around. It's time to experiment, maybe even sexually. Time to get out of their systems, these things out of their systems before they're tied down by real-life responsibilities, especially responsibilities of matrimony, of marriage. Since this is a stage that is often associated with meeting a marital partner, the person you're going to marry and be with hopefully the rest of your life, playing the field is encouraged. Dating, many times, getting to know people, because you couldn't just possibly get to know one person and that be enough. What if there's somebody better out there? And because of the sexual drive and the greater capacity for mature relationships, couples often become both sexually and emotionally intimate more and more quickly. Unfortunately for our kids, relationships can also dissolve just as quickly. So again, imagine that 8th grade girl who had this boy who they were together and they liked each other and it hurt. Imagine how much more it hurts when that relationship blows up in their face and she's already given herself emotionally, deep emotionally, and even sexually, because you don't get that back. And then the last one is this young adulthood stage that the anthropologist is talking about. At this stage, many find themselves in two groups. Those still playing the field, those still who are just dating for the sake of dating, maybe even just for sexual release and things like that, enjoying their freedom. And there's that group of those who are more seriously searching for that one that they could marry. Either way, they're exploring their options. And usually being productive members of society. Sometimes they have jobs, they're going to school, they have some sort of direction in their life, and they will usually end up married, but it comes from different motivations. Even though it comes from different motivations, you often have similar results because you're doing this test, you have those groups who are like, I'm just going to date for the sake of dating and just have fun, versus those who are like, I'm going to monogamously date, of like, I'm only dating one person at a time, but you're still doing the same kind of things. You're experimenting sexually, you're doing these kind of things, and you still have the same kind of effects that could really end up hurting somebody. So let's take a moment. I want you to take a moment after we just discussed these different stages from an anthological perspective, think about where your child is at, or your children are at right now. Do you think this is accurate of them? Do you think that wherever they're at, elementary, middle school, high school, going into young adult, do you think that this could encompass a general perspective of who they are, where they're at right now? And the thing is that the general reaction that parents would say is that we agree. We say, yeah, that kind of aptly describes where my kid's at right now. But you also have this other reaction of, that may be true for other parents or other kids of other parents, but my kids, because we've taught them biblical views, they're not going to do that stuff. They'll be all right. They'll be fine. However, when you look at the statistics, you get another scary picture. 88% of ages 18 to 29 of non-married people are having sex. And it only drops down a mere 8 percentage points when you look at the same age groups for non-married evangelical Christians. Woo, we're 8% better than the regular population. That means only instead of 9 out of 10, only 8 out of 10 of your kids, your Christian kids, are having sex. And it's not just, I want to be clear on this, it's not just a decision that they wake up and decide. No, you guys have been there. It's not just something you wake up and decide. It's a process. It happens throughout these kids' lives, through these stages that we talked about, as they get indoctrinated into it, as they get exposed to it, as the world begins to shape their minds, or if you guys are shaping their minds. The consequences of premarital sex. Now, let's talk about the consequences of premarital sex, because some are more obvious, and some are those ones that we tend to throw at our kids in health class at some point in high school or middle school. There's a danger of contracting an STD, a sexually transmitted disease. While the rates of STDs have gone up, the world has responded with this answer of, well, we got protection now. We got condoms. We have the pill. We have contraceptives. So that limits the danger. That's the idea of it. Limits the danger of contracting something. But I think what's scarier is that it limits the idea of danger for kids, because they're like, well, if I use these things, then nothing bad's going to happen. I'm not going to get nothing. I'm going to be fine. There's also this heightened possibility of pregnancy. This possibility of pregnancy. While pregnancy is supposed to be this joyful part of life because we're celebrating life and parents bringing a child into the world, it also comes at a great cost. While many pregnancies today happen out of wedlock or for single parents, the danger is somewhat limited, again, by condoms and birth control. And again, that idea of safety. Because these kids are like, well, if I use a condom, if I'm on the pill, it's 99 point whatever accurate or works that much of the time, or, I don't have to worry about these things. And that's a dangerous mentality to have, because we don't control what's going to happen. That's God's job, so you don't know. But those are the two main consequences that we talk about with our kids, because we hope it'll scare them. We hope it'll be like, hey, you could get pregnant or you can get some kind of STD. Don't have sex, at least not before marriage. But how about the not so obvious consequences that we don't always talk about? For instance, the deep emotional wounds that come from having sex before it's time. That come from giving away a part of yourself to another who won't be your future spouse. From being taken advantage of and left as though you were not worth the trouble at all. It's in the book, the author mentions a great analogy from a South African pastor, P.J. Smith. He calls it the Foundational Timebomb. He lived, this South African pastor, he lived in a flat in Zimbabwe for a time. And he lived right next to this huge hole. It's about half the size of a football field. I don't know if that's soccer football or American football, but you get this picture that it's really big and wide. And it's really deep. It's like 40 meters deep. And it was the foundation of this huge skyscraper that they were going to build. And the bizarre thing, the thing that this South African pastor found bizarre was that there was no one guarding this giant hole in between construction. There were even portions of time where the hole was left unguarded for weeks. And he had this idea. I don't know if I would have thought about this, but he had this idea. But why guard an empty hole, right? But he thought that if he had so desired, he could have gone down in that hole without much of a problem. You just got to go down there if nobody's guarding it. I mean, just gravity will take you down there. But if he had wanted to, he could have gone down in that hole without any problem. And imagine if someone had wanted to destroy that skyscraper. Do you think the best way would be to, once it's built up, it's strong, it's up there, it's made, to get a wrecking ball and start hacking away at it? You think that's the way that it's going to bring it down the most easily? Or do you think rather than taking a wrecking ball to it after it's built, a clever person would go down in that big hole that's not guarded, and they would dig a few holes of their own and lay some explosives, and then set the fuse for 3 or 4 years later. And then you climb out and you walk away, and the beauty would be that probably no one would ever suspect you. That is the foundation. That hole right there is the foundation of your marriage. It's pre-marriage. It's those premarital years. And if Satan can sneak in and mess you up during those years, then he is well on the way to destroy your marriage long before it's even started. And the genius of this plan is that he'll make you believe that your marriage doesn't start until you say, I do. That's crazy to me, of this idea of, think if you had this foundation, this time, these kids, as they're in elementary, as they're in middle school, as they're in high school, as they're young adults, this is the foundation that that you guys are laying, and they're laying for themselves, because it's prepping them for marriage. And if we're not careful, those foundations, some explosives, maybe some bad concrete, different things get in there that later on, that foundation that's supposed to keep you rock solid, the parable of the man who built his house on the rock versus the man on the sand. Well, even if you got a rock and there's a bomb in it, what good is it? It's that hidden consequence that we don't often think about, because we don't think about, well, when they're in middle school, we should be prepping them for marriage already. It's like that's a later conversation that comes later when they're older and when they're closer to that time. But no, it's not. So here's some more scary statistics to back up that analogy for you. In 2011, at the University of Iowa, they studied the link between teenage sex and divorce rates in women. Married women who had sex as teenagers, of these women, 31% divorced within 5 years, and 47% divorced within 10 years. Married women who delayed, these married women who had, in this group who had delayed sex into adulthood, not necessarily till marriage, but at least into adulthood, had a divorce rate of 15%. That's about half of that group by 5 years. And they had a rate of 27% of divorce at 10 years. Again, that's about half the rate of those who had sex when they were teenagers. 80% of those women who had no previous sexual partners were in stable marriages. Actually, that's from another classic study from 10,000 women in 1995. 80% of those women who had no previous sexual partners were in stable marriages. And about 44% of those who had only 2 sexual partners before were in stable marriages. That's half as much as those who had not had sex. So let me repeat that. 44% of women who had only 2 sexual partners were in stable marriages. 80% of that, nearly double the percentage of those who had none, were in stable marriages. Double your likelihood. And I don't want to just focus on women here, but these studies were done, or we're focusing on women. But you got to think, they're married to a man. So you'd think the statistics are going to be similar for the men as well. Because if your significant other, if your spouse isn't happy in your relationship, you're probably not happy in your relationship either. So helping our kids guard their hearts. So as parents, you need to safeguard your kids now and not just give unbridled freedom to explore the unknown. As these new emotions begin to stir within our kids, there are some practical ways to provide a covering of protection for your kids right now. For instance, you can talk with your kids about emotional purity. Sooner than you think, though. If our kids know what to expect before it hits them, then they will be more prepared to deal with it as it comes along. Emotional purity is this idea of not just sexual purity of what you do with your body, but what you do with your heart. Turn feelings of attraction for the opposite sex into teachable moments. Ask them, what do you like when they start to have this like, oh, I think they're attractive, or oh, I think I like them and stuff. It's like asking those questions, what do you like about him or her? Asking that question of what types of qualities does this person have that you might want to have in your future spouse? Training them even when they're younger. Like, is that somebody you can marry though? Is not saying it quite like that, but is this, what are the qualities at least that you see that you'd want? Get them to start thinking about it earlier. Be mindful of our kids' friends and their perspectives and values regarding the opposite sex. Kids, their peers, especially once you get into middle school and high school, can be great, important influences. And that's important for you as parents to know. Because if these other kids are talking about how cute the boy or this girl is all the time, then don't be surprised when your kids start to talk like that too. And this can occur even in faith-based communities like our own. It's not just limited to the outside world. And while these friendships I'm not saying they necessarily need to end right there. It's not like, whoop, they started talking about boys and girls, we're shutting you in a room, you can't talk to your friends anymore until you're 25. That's not what I'm saying here. But we need to prepare them to talk. We need to prepare our kids, talk to them about our family runs differently, by a different set of moral values or values than others might. And maybe they're talking about this, but you got to realize you got to guard your heart. You got to realize that what they're talking about is getting in your heart, and it's changing your thought process about emotional purity and sexual purity and these other difficult topics. And lastly, from that desire to connect emotionally, again, we've talked about this, we have this desire that we want to connect deeply and emotionally with others. Take that emotional connection, that desire that they have, strive to push your kids into deeper emotional relationships with Christ. We are all given by God this yearning for this greater connection. Unfortunately, we often turn to the romantic relationships to find fulfillment, to fulfill that desire, instead of towards Christ, like was intended. We need to demonstrate the love of Christ and how fulfilling our lives can be with Him in it versus with Him out of it. And encourage our kids to do the same. Our identity should be found in Christ, not in our relationships of this world. For relationships and people of this world, they're going to fail us at some point. Even your best friends, they're going to let you down sometimes. But God, Christ, He never will. And if you show that kind of relationship, that kind of mentality, your kids are going to learn from that. Your kids are going to grow from that and start to develop that kind of mentality too. They're not going to be perfect, but it's a start. So let's talk about excuses. One of the most important steps we must all take through this idea is what's holding us back from having these conversations with our kids. Unfortunately, it can be awkward. It can be uncomfortable. It can be anxiety-provoking. And there's no perfect guide or formula to how to talk to our kids or how to instructionally teach them. And maybe that's a good thing, though. Because if we all had this all-inclusive formula that says, at this age you do exactly this, and at this age you do exactly that, then we probably wouldn't leave room for God and the direction of the Holy Spirit. So my question is, what's holding you back? Sometimes it's that no one modeled it for you, or no one modeled it for us. Our parents dropped the ball. Your parents dropped the ball. You had to figure it out on your own. Your parents were overcome by the awkwardness of talking about sex and saying physiologically correct words like penis or vagina or something like that, and they couldn't overcome that fear. So they didn't talk to you about it. They're like, well, we'll let them figure it out on their own. And so since they didn't talk to you, you don't exactly have a model to go off of with your kids. Maybe you're afraid to take away their innocence too soon. And that's a valid fear. You don't want to start talking to a 5-year-old about sex or things like that if they haven't been exposed to it. You don't want to make them start thinking about that kind of stuff well before their mind is ready. The unfortunate part, though, too, is that our kids are getting exposed and losing their innocence sooner than we realize anyway. So if we don't talk about it earlier, the world will. Maybe you just aren't relating to these struggles. Maybe the struggles of this generation just don't make sense to you. Maybe they have a specific topic or theme in their life that's like, I didn't go through that struggle, so I don't know how to get through it, or I don't know how to talk about it. And so you have this idea of like, if I haven't gone through it, then I can't talk to you about it. But we know that that's not true either. Maybe you feel like a hypocrite because you did the same things that your kids are doing now when you were a kid or when you were a teenager or a young adult. Maybe you're afraid they'll ask you about it. And what would you say? Like, what do you say? It can be difficult to share those weaker sides of ourselves, like where we messed up. And we might fear, like, if we share this part of ourselves, will they think that it's okay? Will they judge me for it? Will they see me differently? And those are valid fears, but they're also holding us back. But whatever your excuse is, you can't let it hold you back from having these discussions with your kids. Now let's talk about influence. As we talked about a little earlier, you as parents have such a great and important influence over your kids. In Malachi 4:6, it gives a prophecy about the new Elijah who will turn the hearts of parents to their children and the hearts of their children to their parents. Then likewise, again, in Luke 1:17, it says, turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient, probably the children, to the wisdom of the righteous to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Now, that was really interesting to me. If you have this, one of the last verses in the Old Testament, and one of the first in the Gospel, one of the first sets of in the New Testament, and they're both with this theme of the importance of heart connection with your kids, between parents and children. We need to have our child's heart, and they have ours. And there are no shortcuts. You shouldn't strive to be emotionally disconnected. That some parents I've seen and talk about in the book of parents are like, well, I don't want to be my kid's buddy. I'm not their friend. So I'm not, my goal is I don't want them to like me. I just want them to respect me, or I just want them to obey me. It's kind of missing the point. But you shouldn't, in the same way, strive to be their buddy, because if you just are their buddy or their friend, then they don't see you as that authority figure or that authority in their lives to help them get through that. It's just like, oh, we can gossip, we can talk, but I'm going to do what I want still. And when you try to enforce rules, then I don't have to listen because you've shown me that I don't have to listen. You're just my buddy. But you should strive for their heart, because as the first line says, rules without relationship often equals rebellion. If you don't have their heart, if you don't have a relationship with your kid, with your children, then often they rebel. Often they'll try to be more sneaky. They'll be like, okay, mom, dad, I won't do that in front of your face. I'll just go off and do it when you're not looking. And when the love relationship is severed or broken, our ability to influence the next generation is limited. This biblical perspective, this biblical theme of talking about the connectivity of your hearts with your kids. Obviously, you're the authority. Obviously, they need to obey you and things like that. But I thought it was really interesting that it's talking about this heart connection of like the importance of your relationship with your kid will affect whether or not they obey you. It may change the question of, if I do this, how mad are my parents going to be at me? How in trouble am I going to get? Versus this question of, if I do this, how much will it hurt my parents? You guys see the difference there? It's one saying, I don't want to get in trouble. The other one saying, like, I know I'll disappoint them. I know I'll hurt them. Whether or not they still do it is up to them. But it's a big difference. So the parental influence over important topics in their kids' lives. You guys have that influence. Unfortunately, many parents have bought this lie that they don't have much influence in their kids' lives, especially compared to their kids' peers, their kids' friends. This is especially true when it comes to sex and relationships. And so often parents are in this idea that they need to wait for their kids to come to them. We already talked about kids don't always come to you when they have hard questions or topics. Sometimes you need to ask them. Sometimes you need to encourage them to talk to you. But we also have seen the problems when we wait, when we don't initiate. And research has shown us that lie, that is a lie. You have more influence than you think. Oenheiser and Bush did a study in 2012 about influences in who influences teenagers the most. And their finding regards into issues like drinking alcohol. Parents were the number one influence on 73% of those teenagers. 73%. Their best friends were listed as number one influences by 8% of the teenagers. Only 8. And they also found not only that parents were the number one influence for the vast majority of them, but when it comes to parental influence, it was maximized when leveraged or when dealt through this idea of having a healthy relationship with your kid, with your child. You're more of an influence when you have a relationship with them, when they want to talk to you, when you're open, when you've shown them love and things like that. You don't want to talk to somebody who's just going to judge you or punish you or just tell you all the things or all the ways that you messed up. Without that loving part of it. The Bible says tell the truth in love, not just tell them how bad they are or how big they messed up. According to a study by the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy in 2012, 87% of teens who were asked believed that it would be easier to postpone sexual activity and avoid teen pregnancy if they were able to have open and honest conversations about these topics with their parents. 87%. If we have a good relationship and we talk and we're open and honest about it, I think I could do a better job of keeping myself accountable and asking for accountability. 35% reported that their parents were most influential in their dating decisions. That's 35%. It might seem low, but let's look at the other percentages as well. Comparatively, you have only 28%, a 7% decrease for their friends. So they take 28% of the time they look to their friends or say that they're most influential. And then you have this 3% who said it's religious leaders. So it's not our pastors, it's not our youth leaders, it's not our teachers who are the most influential on your kids, it's you guys. And that has huge implications. So how do we get our child's heart? So we now know that we have greater influence on our kids' lives than we thought. But now how do we get their hearts? Firstly, we need to invest significant time in the relationship. We all have busy, crazy schedules. That is so true. We can all find excuses or something that would come up. But there is no asset like time. We get caught up in these things in our life. Our work, we say we're tired. We have so many different things that get in our ways that we could think of, that we often have more excuses to not do it and postpone it till later. A study published in Child Development in 2009 found that family activities were the most important protective factor against teen sex. That includes activities simply like having family dinners together or having a family game night every once in a while. If they're with you guys and show them that you guys can have fun as a family and grow and be open in a safe environment there, they might be less tempted to go out into the world or have less of a need to go figure it out by themselves out in the world. So that time is crucial because you don't get it back either. We must take an interest in their world. I'm not just saying like, oh, how's your day? Oh, that's cool. Yeah, all right, see you later. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about many teenagers complain that their parents don't listen to them, but their friends do. So they're going to go talk to their friends about those deep, intimate questions and conversations. But if you weren't listened to in an area of your life, why wouldn't you pull away? Why wouldn't you go away from that relationship? Kids can tell when you are genuinely listening. If you're over here on your computer and you're typing and you're focusing on work or you're doing the dishes or something like that, and your kid's over here and you're like, yeah, that's great, go do the garbage. They can see that you're not focusing on them. You're not really listening. That doesn't count. We must offer them words that show sincere empathy. Again, that sincerity, that genuineness. We all seek that emotional validation. We all like to be heard. Sometimes we, again, find excuses to say, we'll listen to you later. Or maybe our tone or body language is telling our kids that we're not really listening again, or focusing or that we're focusing on other things. When your child wants to talk or tell you something, you should try to give them your full attention, even if it's just for a minute, and respond genuinely, because that way you can respond genuinely. Because those moments are precious. Of like, and you're teaching your kids something too. If your child comes to you with a question or they want to talk to you, they're not always going to do that. And if you show them that you're not going to listen or respond well, then they're going to learn like, I probably could talk to them, but my friends will probably listen better or something like that too. Or my parents are busy. I don't want to bother them. I don't want to disappoint them. And they kind of learn to stop asking those questions too. We must use touch in an appropriate way, especially for younger kids, because those elementary school kids and sometimes those early middle school kids, they crave those hugs. They want mommy and daddy's attention. They want to be loved, and they want hugs and kisses. But as they get older, for those of you who have teenagers and those you might be about to have them, you'll realize it gets more complicated. They probably don't want to be smothered in front of their friends. They'll be like, "Oh, Mom, you're embarrassing me. Stop it." But a good hug and a private moment of confidence can go a long way. If you're talking about something deep and hurtful or sensitive, or they're feeling insecure, maybe that's a chance to give them a hug. And each kid's different. Each one will kind of want and you're going to have to pray diligently and think about where your kid's at and what they want. But meeting them where they're at, because they want that. And last, we should bathe our kids in unconditional love. Our kids must be convinced, and we must strive to convince them that our love for them is like God's love for them. Not based upon what they do or how they act, but upon who they are in Christ. This is done through all the aforementioned ideas. And this next part that I'm going to talk about isn't from this book. It's from the 5 love languages in children. I would recommend that book as well. It talks about different stages and what each of the 5 love languages is, and what it looks like at different stages, depending on where your kid's at, in elementary, middle school, high school, whatever. Because when I was looking at these ideas from the book of the talks that talks about like how do we get our child's heart, I thought immediately, I was like, maybe it seemed familiar to you guys too, who know about the 5 love languages. This idea that we have 5 primary love languages, which include physical touch, words of affirmation, gifts, acts of service, and quality time. But what was crazy is that I noticed in the last slide, when it was talking about appropriate touch, when it's talking about spending time with your kids, when it's talking about affirming your kids with empathic words, I'm like, those are the 5 love languages. I was like, that's really cool. Because I love the 5 love languages, and talking about that and knowing your own and knowing your kids or your family can be so beneficial. You guys can grow so much because our love languages, what we like to receive versus like how we like to show love, can be very different than those people around us and how they like to receive and give love. Because you can be like, oh, I gave you the best gift in the world. I love giving gifts. I love giving gifts. And somebody's like, oh, it's a sweater. That's nice. That's nice. But I'd rather, that person might be a quality time person, and they'll be like, I want to spend time with you, Mom. I want to spend time with you, Dad. Like, that sweater's nice, but I want your time. And if you don't know, or if you don't match up with your kids or your spouse or things like that, it's important to know so that you can grow in that area and provide the love that they need and want, not only the one that you know how to give or that you want to give. And that can be a struggle. So how do we discover what our child's primary love language is, as we go off on this little bit of a tangent, but I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about, is that for one, maybe two or so of these love languages are going to speak more deeply of your love to them. You know, when they get that gift, when you spend that time with them, when you give that word of encouragement, they're going to feel it, and they're going to feel that love stronger from you, and you'll see a difference. And that same one or two love languages, when used negatively, will cause so much more hurt than the other one. Of like, if you didn't put time into that gift, if the whole time you were spending time with them, you were on your phone or you're focusing on work, you know, if those words are like, yeah, that's nice. When they're like, Mom, look at my picture, look at my homework, look, I got an A, I got a star, and you're like, that's great. You know, that's a word of affirmation, but is it really from the heart? Like, when used negatively, it can hurt them. That same one, and you'll see the difference. Another way is you need to observe how your child likes to express love to you as parents. Like, you'll often see that the ones that they like to use the most, they'll use with you, and you'll see which ones they're using. You need to observe how they express that love to others as well, because it'll tend to be the same ones that they use with you too. So you get that well-rounded population of like, okay, this is what they use with me. This is what they tend to use with others. There's some consistencies. That's probably what their primary love language is. Maybe I should start using that one too for them so that they know that I know that. Listen to what they request most often. Of like, are they saying, do I want time with Mom and Dad? Do I want this, Xbox from Mom and Dad? Do I want your words of affirmation? Do I want these? What do I want from you? What are they requesting the most often? Also, on the other side of that, what are they complaining most frequently about? Are they saying, we never spend time together, or you never listen to me, or you never give me anything, or all that? What are they saying? What are they complaining about? That's that hurt that we're talking about. And that last one of give your child a choice between two options. Like, this could be a good test, of like, if they had to choose between quality time and they had to choose between a gift of like, hey, we can either spend this Sunday afternoon after church, we can hang out, we can play some board games, or we can do this together, or I can take you to the mall and buy you that really nice pair of shoes that you wanted, or something like that, for a reward, if that's what it's for. It's like, which one are they choosing? Because one's showing that they prefer the gift, one's showing that they prefer the quality time with you. And you can narrow it down as you give them, to make them choose between the options. So the reason I talk about the love languages is because I think it's so beneficial if you know yours, if you know theirs, and can really speak into their lives and help win their heart, because you're showing them love in the way that most deeply speaks to them. Mistakes. In the same way that we need to talk about showing love, we need to talk about mistakes. Because not just your kids' mistakes, but you're going to make mistakes as well. Grace is absolutely necessary when your kids and you fail. Prevention to try and stop your kids and yourselves from messing up is great. It's important. We've just been talking about prevention. They say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of correction later, or something like that. However, we are human, and we will mess up. It is in these moments that we need to check our own attitudes as parents and as adults, as caregivers, about this issue. If we don't recognize the propensity towards our sin in ourselves, then we probably have that. We have issues that we need to deal with long before we deal with the issues of the mistakes related to our kids, because we all need a Savior. We all need to be forgiven. And this begs the question of what is your attitude like? Is it that right or wrong focused, meaning you only discuss the idea of you did a good job or you did a bad job, or you did something right or you did something wrong, and that's all you talk about? Or is it this repentance and restoration idea focused, meaning you help your kids to see their faults? They gotta know that they messed up. Yeah, tell them they did good, they did bad, because they need to know the difference. But also helping them to ask for repentance and seek restoration with you, seek forgiveness with you, and those that they've wronged, and with God especially. So what does this merciful, forgiving attitude and extending it to others look like in our everyday lives for our kids? First, help them to acknowledge that they blew it. Again, that idea of like they need to know when they did something wrong before they can seek restoration. You have to admit that you've sinned, and you do it in a loving way that helps them to see that they've messed up. Help them, once they've received it, once they've said, okay, I blew it, I agree with you, then you can move on to the next one. If you help them to lead them to repent and offer complete forgiveness from both God and from us. Because we are a model or an example of how we're supposed to be anyway, of like how God forgives us with grace that we don't deserve. And sometimes our first reaction should not be to scold or to punish. It should be to show forgiveness and grace. Yes, they should still receive consequences, of course, because consequences are how we learn and how we grow. And God and Jesus in the Bible talk about grace and mercy all the time, but that doesn't mean that they always took away the consequences of your actions. You know, if you get somebody pregnant, it's not just going to go away. You still have that consequence, but you can help them to accept that in love and in a repenting, graceful type of way. And the consequences should always teach a lesson. The consequences should always have this idea of like, how am I going to grow from this? How am I going to learn from this? Not just go sit in timeout, you did something wrong, think about what you did, and they just twiddle their thumbs and do nothing. If it does, if the consequence doesn't match the crime or the mistake, then they're not going to learn. They're just going to be like, okay, I'm done. I'm going to go play now. The next is help them position themselves to avoid the same mistakes in the future. Even when a child or teen repents and asks for forgiveness, it can still be difficult to change that habit or that sin. This means that as parents, you may need to help them remove temptation from their lives and be alongside them for their struggles, which can be difficult, as we talk about. We all got busy lives. We all got things going on. It could mean establishing more rigid boundaries on that computer. Don't let them have it alone in the room, only in the common areas, you know. Helping them to end a toxic friendship of saying, like, not forcing them to, but helping them to realize, like, maybe this isn't a good relationship for you. Look at all the bad things. Look at what they're leading you down, and help them through that stuff, because leaving a friend behind can be really tough. Whatever it may be, everyone needs loving accountability and people committed to their wholeness, to their character, to who they are. Last is teach them love and freedom. We are all sons and daughters of Christ, of God. Many times after we sin, Satan tells us that we are sinners and we could never live up to the standards of Christ. So don't even bother. But Paul wrote in Galatians 5:1, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm and do not let yourselves be burdened again by yoke of slavery. Is reminding your kids that once they are forgiven, they are free from that burden. That doesn't mean that they can keep doing the same things that they're doing or that they were doing, and they need to work towards that. But if we are free from these burdens, we can also learn that we can love others and forgive others and have forgiving hearts as well, which can be really difficult sometimes. So, before you all go, I wanted you to think about this and realize what you're up against, because we are in a spiritual warfare when it comes to sexual purity and emotional purity, and we kind of have our backs up against a wall in a lot of ways. You've seen the statistics now. You know how dangerous this topic and things like that can be. And in our daily lives, we are in this warfare with our kids, not with them, but like on their side. We're on their side. We're with them against it. So what is this idea of what does the enemy have coming up against us? These ideas that he's put into society that are working against us. This question of is not, it's just biological, it's hormonal, you can't do anything about it, there's nothing to do with your spiritual life. Of like your emotional purity, your sexual purity has nothing to do with your spiritual life, and it doesn't affect you in any other realms. Don't worry about it. Keep the parents distracted. Keep them so distracted that they don't have time to build those meaningful relationships with their kids. They're so focused on work, they're so focused on other things that they focus on the things that are immaterial that don't matter. Like, oh, I need to get them to soccer practice. Oh, I need to get them to this music lesson. Just getting them to and doing the task versus focusing on the relationship of how am I building my relationship with my kid? How am I showing them love? How am I growing with them? One is destroy the father relationship with their daughters. I would argue the fathers with their sons as well, but that father figure, especially in the States, you have high rates of single parents, often moms, not dads with just their kids. And when you destroy that father relationship, you think of God Father, you think of Abba Father, and it can hurt that relationship not only between their earthly father but their heavenly Father. And since we all have this desire to seek after that intimacy and that connection, if that earthly and heavenly father relationship is hurt, whether for daughter or son, often they seek that attention from other areas. Like we said, from peers, from other kids and things like that. Make sex taboo. Make it that it is way too difficult and awkward to talk about, very uncomfortable, and that way parents and kids can't discuss it because it's just too weird, it's too awkward, it's just too much. Assume someone else is talking to your kids about these tough topics. Often we assume that, again, our pastors, our youth leaders, sometimes the teachers, or vice versa, like the pastors or the youth leaders or teachers assuming that the parents are doing it. So if everybody thinks the other person is doing it, nobody's doing it. It's a good tactic of like, we have the tendency of not volunteering to do something. We have that tendency of saying like, I'll wait until the next person comes along and they'll do it. Or, oh, that's the church's job. Oh, that's the pastor's job. No. The Bible tells us it's our job as parents to have those conversations with the kids. Likewise, going along with that, convince parents it's the other's job. Say it's like, Mom, that's your job to talk about this. I know we didn't talk about it, but I don't want to talk about it, so you're going to talk about it with the kids. Or vice versa of, hey, Dad, I want you to talk about the kids. You're the man. You should be the one to do this. But it's really a team effort. But if you think the other one's going to do it, or if you have those expectations the other one's going to do it, and even if the other one does do it, you miss out on something when not both of the parents are involved. Another thing you're up against, put sexual images everywhere. Put it in music videos, put it in the lyrics, put it in TV, put it in movies, put it in billboards and advertising, you name it, so that the kids begin to lose their innocence at a much earlier age. Convince the kids that the parents are clueless. They have no idea what they're talking about. They're old-fashioned. They're old. Like, they haven't dated in forever. So what could they possibly know about worldly dating or the intimate relationships between the opposite sex? So I'm going to go to my friends, and I'm going to go to the world to look at what relationships are supposed to look like and what's appropriate and what's not. But we already know if we go to the world, if they go to their friends who aren't the wisest of people all the time, that they're going to get the wrong ideas. Get the kids hooked early. Get preteens looking at pornography and sexual images early so they'll have much more difficult of a time stopping later. Again, we talked about in that group from that study when it asked porn addicts when they became addicted, it was the majority of them said between 12 and 14. So if it starts earlier, it's so much harder to stop later. Last, make parents think they have plenty of time. That lie, that thought of assumption that I can talk to them about it later. That they will put, if we can put these talks off and we can put our relationships off with our kids until it's too late. And then you're going to have those regrets again of, why didn't I talk about it? Why didn't I work on my relationship now? Because time flies. Before you know it, your kid's going to be moving from elementary to middle to high to they're off in the world on their own. And if at that point, you can only put into their lives what they're willing to come to you for, what they're willing to listen. You kind of lost them at that point. Lifeguards. In the book, it uses this analogy of lifeguards. There are two types of lifeguards, and we as parents are those lifeguards. It says there are those lifeguards who are always running drills. They're always blowing their whistle. They're always practicing, even when it's annoying, of like, okay, everybody out the pool, we got to do a drill, all right? They're always blowing their whistles, saying, kids, that's dangerous, don't do that. And even if they do it a million times, and be like, okay, you're going to sit out now. Even if it's annoying. They point out the dangerous things. They genuinely care and want to preserve life. You know, that's the kind of pool I want to be in. That's the kind of amusement park I want to be in, where the lifeguards are paying attention, they care, even if it's annoying sometimes. It's like, okay, I jumped in a little too fast. Okay, I'm sorry, I wasn't in past the 6 foot mark when I jumped in. I'm sorry, you know. Okay, I pushed the other kid in, but it was funny. But they're calling me out on it. They're helping me. Even if I continue to make mistakes sometimes, they're helping me, and they genuinely care. You can see that because of the time and the effort that they put into their duty and their job. And then there are those who sit in their chairs. They're half asleep. We've all seen these lifeguards. They're half asleep. They have their earbuds in. They're listening to music, and they're hardly paying attention. Maybe they truly care. Maybe they don't want anybody to die. But it's hard to say when you don't see them putting in the effort. You don't see them putting into practice. You don't see them calling out the kids that are running and jumping and doing dangerous things until it's too late, when a kid bonks his head on the side and it's like, okay, now I got to jump in the water. You know, now I got to do something. But at that point, they're already bleeding from the head. They're already drowning. So you as parents are these lifeguards for your kids. And that question of, which one are you going to be? So now it's time to act. After learning all this, after learning all that, what are we doing? What are we doing now? Some practical things that we should be doing, or that you can do moving forward, is get both you and your spouse on the same page, essentially. Married and divorced parents alike, not just married, but those single parents as well. Got to try to put in that effort to talk to the ex husband or wife. If parents are struggling, then you can bet their kids are going to struggle as well. And when you talk to each other and make sure that you have the same standards and convictions, because again, remember that story of the mom wanted to put guidelines on. The mom wanted to be like, I want to have a say in who my daughter or son dates, but the dad's like, they'll figure it out. It's fine. When you have that kind of discrepancy, like, you're going to have problems. You guys got to be on the same page, have that united front when you come to your kids. You need to evaluate where your kids are at this moment, whether they're in elementary, whether in high school, whether they're middle, whether they're a young adult. Examine their age, the time development, what you know personally about them and their environment, and pray for insight in where they are and their unique challenges that they face today, so you can work to address it. Because if you start trying to problem solve before you know the problem, you often run into more problems. You need to develop a plan. Think about the future. What are your family views on dating? What parameters will we set in the future for those guidelines? What are those guidelines that general guidelines you're going to establish, especially on how you're going to train your kids on biblical thinking with issues such as relationships, particularly with the opposite sex? Take a few small steps as soon as possible. After evaluating where your child is at in this moment, think of ways you can address or even deliberate about your relationship with your child now, and do it. Because we often fall into that trap of, again, that assumption we have time. Or maybe sometimes it's just laziness or tiredness or whatever, but we put it off. And when we say we're going to do something now, when we say we're going to look at this process, when we say that we're going to do something, see where they're at now, even if it's something just as little as working on, well, not little, but as big as working on the relationship with your kid when they're in elementary school versus wait until they're in high school, you avoid this temptation to wait and do nothing. Surround yourself with like-minded parents. Because this whole process, you guys know as parents, it's crazy difficult. It's super hard. And you need that support. You need like-minded parents, especially other Christian parents who have the same kind of ideas of like, okay, these are some big topics, and this is how we dealt with it. because this whole process can be very draining and discouraging. But with like-minded parents, you have support, and maybe even people who are a little ahead of you, of like, oh yeah, I remember when little Susie, she was in 8th grade and she started liking the boys, or when he was in high school and he started noticing this, or he started doing this, and you can have some greater advice or greater support when it comes to these difficult subjects, these difficult topics. And that could be so helpful and encouraging to have people who are going to support you. That's why God made us social creatures and calls us to be parts of community, because he wants us to have that kind of support. He wants us to have loving accountability. I want you all to know that this book offers, I didn't go through every single chapter, obviously, don't have that kind of time, but I want you to know that the book offers details on 15 specific conversations that you should probably have sooner than you think as well. If you're interested in finding that or reading it, it includes topics such as the opposite sex, preparation, accountability, marriage, abuse, social media, pornography, and the rest that lead up to 15. But the last thing that I want you to remember as you go away, because I know I scared you guys a lot. I know I threw a lot of information at you. I know that it can be very intimidating. But I want to leave you with a word of encouragement. Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Maybe we all know this one. It's pretty common. But be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Matthew 28:20. I am with you always. Remember, you are not alone. You do not need to take this on as just you don't need to just take it on as a married couple. You don't need to take it on as just a family. You have other families, you have other supports, you have the church, you have the school here. I know we love to help in any way that we can, and God is always there, ready to listen when you're ready to be prayerful and mindful of him and his will and his way and his process and things like that. But that can be difficult to focus on sometimes when we're so caught up in our own things and our hurts and our pains and our confusion and our doubts and our insecurities. But he is with us always. And you are not alone in this battle, in this warfare. And you guys can do it. I mean, that's the lie that Satan wants you to think, is that you guys can't do this. But you can. Nobody's going to be perfect. We're all going to make mistakes. But with these kind of biblical values, these kind of biblical processes and thinking, it matters that we've been provided with to some degree, and with the support and love of our Christian communities, you guys can go forward, and your kids, as sometimes despite ourselves, are going to turn out great, even if they have to get some bumps on their heads before they get there. So that's all I have for you guys today. If you have any questions, you can ask them now, or if it's more personal, we can talk more individually as well. If you want my notes, you guys are more than willing to have them. Other than that, you guys, I hope you have a great day and that you got something out of this too.